I need a car that you put some liquid in and it drives, and no horses, please. That's the definition of a good car. I think AI is the same way. If we spend all our time thinking about safety mechanisms and AI, the team that didn't think about the safety mechanism will release the first actual GAI first.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is a Reacts episode. Industry insiders having frank debates about the latest tech, politics, and business news. Whether you're a founder, investor, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights into how current events connect to broader themes and trends that impact your startup, your investments, and your day-to-day operational decisions. The conversation starts now.
Hey, I'm Chris Saad.
I'm Yaniv Bernstein.
Hi, I'm Amir Shevat.
Welcome to another episode of the Startup Podcast Reacts. On today's show, we're going to talk about the Scale AI CEO talking about meritocracy, deriding and derailing DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, as a distraction from building the best possible team. Is he right? Is he wrong? Where does this all go? We'll also discuss Ilya, the co-founder of OpenAI, who recently left, starting his new company, SSI, Safe Super Intelligence. In the announcement, he had some very pointed comments that really draw a contrast between how he thinks and what his company will do versus OpenAI, and maybe some of the stuff they've been doing. He thinks is reckless. We'll also be talking about picks and shovels. Are there too many people offering too many tools and not enough people building actual AI breakthroughs and applications? And then we're going to touch on the Vision Pro. It's apparently not going very well for Apple. Demand is low. Users aren't really using the thing. What happens next and what does this mean for founders? And then finally, we're going to talk about the EU charging Microsoft with antitrust because of their behavior with Teams and bundling that with Microsoft Office. All of that and more on this week's episode. Stay tuned.
This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Vanta. I get it. You hear security and compliance and you think time-consuming and stressful. But it's critical for scaling your business. Achieving compliance with ISO 27001, SOC 2, Essential 8, or other in-demand frameworks can unlock major growth for your company, help you sell to the enterprise, and establish customer trust. And with Vanta, you can get compliant in weeks instead of months and save up to 85% of associated costs. And just for TSP listeners, you can get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast.
All right, guys, before we get started on today's show, we've got to talk about the Startup Podcast Pact, which says if you've been listening to the show for a little while and getting value, please subscribe to us in your favorite podcasting app and on YouTube. The YouTube algorithm is starting to show us some love. It's helping us grow the show and helps us help more founders. So please subscribe over there. Shout out on your favorite social network. Help us spread the word. Help us grow the show. It helps us help more founders, get more guests, and ultimately make a better show for everybody. All right, with that, let's get right into it. The first topic we wanted to discuss, and probably the most controversial, is Scale AI's CEO, Alexander Wang, posting an article and a tweet for the last 7 days talking about meritocracy. Now, by way of context, there has been a bit of a religious debate in Silicon Valley for years and years and years, and it flares up every, call it 12 months, 18 months or so, this debate between diversity hiring, women in tech, and meritocracy and the tensions between these things. I've myself sat through, I don't know how many, 5 or 7 here, 12 years that I was here the first time, and I'm sure I'll sit through a bunch more now that I'm spending more time here. And the Scale AI CEO this time around said, he wrote a big post about it, their new, formal, and permanent hiring philosophy, that Scale AI is about meritocracy and must always be about that. It's a big deal whenever we invite someone to join our mission, and our decisions must never be swayed by orthodoxy or virtue signaling or whatever the current thing may be. Now, there's a lot of big names with a lot of big opinions about this. Hopefully we can find some nuance and subtlety to the discussion. I don't think it's straightforward, but let's start with you guys. What do you think about this debate, the tension between diversity, inclusion, equity, and a subset of that debate has been about women in tech, female engineers, and then the tension between meritocracy and all those things?
I think that diversity of thought is important, and therefore diversity is important. For my experience, when I had strongly diverse team, there were challenges, but there were also a lot of value there. The challenges are you have meta information and the communication doesn't always work great. So I had like a PM from India and a lady that was working for him, and that didn't work because it was a lot of tension there. I think that it's okay, and the value that you get from diverse team is worth the effort. I do think that this is drama that the Silicon Valley goes into quite a lot, and the value of the drama is not clear to me. I think that people put too much effort into the drama rather than like doing the right thing of, hey, we need diversity because diversity of thought is important, and diversity of thought creates better products. So I like the idea. I don't like the drama that happens all of a sudden and goes across the Silicon Valley. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So look, here's my thought. I get really irritated in a sense by the polarization where it ends up with these like two extremes. And I kind of feel like a pox on both their houses, right? Like two things are true. One is that diversity is important. Two is that there are systematic structural forms of privilege and whatnot that tend to favor certain in-groups and disfavor certain out-groups. And I do think that both for business reasons, like because diversity is important, and also from a social responsibility point of view, it is important for companies to not just kind of allow those existing systems to completely overtake what they do, such that they just end up being, a bunch of white dudes or whatever. But then on the other side, I think what's happened is that a general movement towards diversity, towards acknowledging those privileges, towards putting some basic systems into place to try to counter those natural biases within the system has become this like highly politicized, highly charged social justice movement where the numeric aspect of diversity and then, privileging race and gender comes above all else. So you end up with these sort of, on the one hand, identity politics, and on the other hand, kind of incumbent privileged groups just leaning into that and saying, I don't have to care about any of this. And I kind of get really irritated with both sides. Yes, merit is important. No traditional systems that have called themselves meritocracies have not been meritocracies because they've been full of white dudes called John running everything, and that is not a meritocracy. So accept that. Don't go all MAGA pill on this and say this is all just woke nonsense. It's not all woke nonsense. There is a real there. On the other hand, has DEI been weaponized and gotten silly and become self-serving and so on? Yes, it has. And so, like with most of these polarized debates, I'm like, hey, there's a sensible middle where everyone should be. And yet, the way the echo chamber works, the way the debate works is you don't find anyone in the middle. And then you just get a bunch of idiots yelling at each other. And frankly, I'm not there for that.
You're totally right. The two polar sides have actually hijacked the conversation.
Yep.
But I don't agree that we shouldn't have meritocracy. I think it's a joint Venn diagram of these two. We need to measure people by the merits of their skill, but we have to have a diverse set of very skillful people. The key is to have both merit-based hiring and diverse inputs and outputs. If we manage to reach that outcome, it's much better than doing in the middle, which is hey, some of you will have merit, some of you will have diversity. So I want to have amazing diverse teams. That's what I want to have.
Diversity is not antithetical to meritocracy. I think what happens is when people say, oh, DEI is rubbish and we want a meritocracy, is saying that basically not paying any attention to any of these structural issues and we're just a meritocracy will work. No, it hasn't worked. That's what companies did in the past, and you ended up with an incredibly homogeneous group of people that did not represent broader society. So what that means is something is wrong in how you are doing your meritocracy. You need to fix it. And that is where, you say, okay, how can we fix it? The problem then is that it's kind of been hijacked by various people for various reasons, either virtue signaling or career building or, naivety into certain DEI programs that don't actually help, that do sort it into two buckets rather than saying, yes, Amir, exactly right. How do we fix our meritocracy rather than how do we throw it out?
Exactly.
So a few thoughts on this. You guys said you don't find people in the middle of this conversation, and that's probably because people that are on the edges are the loudest and the ones that take over a conversation. And I think one of the biggest problems in society today is that the minority of a group that is most extreme is considered representative of the broader group. And this is true of Republicans and Democrats, of Israelis and Palestinians, of DEI advocates and meritocracy advocates. It just happens at the edges of every group. it tends to be an excuse for one side to dismiss the other or label the other as dangerous for the rest of society. And I think that's just a general trend that's very, very dangerous, destructive, and divisive. So just to recap the conflict here, I think the pro-meritocracy people, and just to be very obvious here, meritocracy means deciding things based on merit. They suggest that DEI is essentially subverting the selection criteria, the high bar of meritocracy, in order to hit quotas. That's their argument. It's like we're lowering the bar or making selection for reasons other than meritocracy, other than merit. Pro-diversity people are saying, look, diversity is critical and produces better outcomes, and merit alone is, by definition, a blind spot to people who have had systemic disadvantages, or it's subjective, or people just tend to hire people like them. And it's not really about merit. I think the reality is meritocracy in life in general is actually critical. There has been historically a lack of diversity, and that has been fundamentally bad for society. But we are moving to another extreme in some quarters, in some cases, the lack of merit and a lack of critical competence, and a sense that like elitism and effectiveness is almost derided and divisive. Like, we don't need no elite person in the White House. Anybody can do it. We just need a muckraker and a rule breaker. And it's like, actually, no, that's a really important job that requires competence. And so I think the derision of elitism and competence is a real problem for society. The other reality is that diversity and dealing with structural bias is a real problem. It's something that really needs to be dealt with. It's not something that's in the past. It's not something that's irrelevant. It's not something that's solved. And it's not popular to say, for example, it's a pipeline problem. That's a no-no. That's really bad to say, well, people earlier in the hiring pipeline, school and colleges and so on, let's say for the sake of argument, women, they're dropping out of the pipeline. And so there just simply isn't enough women in engineering to hire a diverse engineering workforce. That is a very unpopular thing because it's perceived as kind of throwing up your hands and just declaring bankruptcy. I think that's bullshit. It is actually a pipeline issue. If you are an executive in a company trying to hire more female engineers, you can't go to the beginning of the pipeline and redefine the pipeline. You can't do that. There are not enough women to hire to have a diverse engineering workforce. It's impossible. And so, like, let's stop bullshitting each other that we can have fully diverse engineering teams across all the companies. And like, it's not going to happen. And so let's just recognize that. And then in some cases, there is an actual, I'll say, deprioritization of competence or of getting shit done in favor of warm and fuzzy safe spaces. And I think that's bullshit as well. And so these are the kind of the unpopular red pill stuff that I think are legitimate. And then there's, as you guys have been saying, this whole like, hey, meritocracy is everything, let's solve it all. We just pick people based on their best brains. That's also been historically bullshit because people just select people like them. So I think the answer, as you said, Amir, is this Venn diagram. It's this ability to hold two ideas in your head at the same time. We want a diverse group of highly competent people, and larger companies, not startups, not early stage startups, but larger companies should invest in supercharging the pipeline, supercharging the depth of their outreach into other pockets of communities, helping with internship programs and mentorship programs. As usual, the answer is all of the above.
I like the idea of a pipeline because I think the way I encourage my engineers to think about diversity is to make sure that the inputs are diverse. I think that if you see enough candidates that are diverse, you will hire a very good merit-based diverse team. So for example, at Slack, we went to groups that we knew were diverse and specifically tried to find the best engineers that we could from all of these groups. So I think if you treat this like an input-output problem, like an engineer, you get better, stronger, more diverse inputs, you will have better, stronger, diverse teams.
Yeah, but the joke here, of course, is, the old Mitt Romney line, we have binders full of women. I actually went, while I was at Uber, I went specifically to a female engineering recruitment company. That was their whole bag. And I asked them to do a search for me for female engineers in San Francisco. And I said, look, my team is nowhere near where I wanted to be in terms of the diversity of thinking. Can you help me out? And together we did a database search for engineers in San Francisco with the criteria we needed. And she had 2 candidates for me from her entire database. So when I talk about a pipeline, Amir, and again, I'm saying this for people in the audience who are sensitive to these things, I'm saying this with full awareness that describing it as a pipeline issue is a very contentious and offensive, in some cases, thing to say. But there was no pocket of people that I could tap in order to change this. And so what I would need to do is then go target more female engineers from other companies, drawing down their diversity and drawing up mine. And so there was this kind of short sheet effect. That, I think, is a real problem that cannot be wished away. It can be invested in. It should be invested in, which is the main criticism of calling it a pipeline problem. But as an executive in a company trying to get shit done and fill heads in your seats, that is a real problem. It's a problem.
I remember back when I was at Google, this debate used to happen internally. And when the pipeline problem question came up, I think one of the responses is, no wonder you have a pipeline problem when the pipeline is full of sharks and acid. And I think the idea there was like, okay, you know what? Like, this is particularly for women, I think, was the idea is that tech is not a welcoming place for them. Now, if you remember that DEI is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think, the pipeline problem is real. There's numbers on it, right? Like there's simply, as you say, the numbers are not even. And when we're talking about gender diversity, there are many sorts of diversity. I'd also want to remind everyone of that. But what's also true is that there are many horrible stories of the experiences that women have had working in tech.
Yes.
And so I always say, like, DEI is nearly like it's backwards, right? You should start with the inclusion piece. Whatever diversity you have, the people who are the minorities along whatever axis of diversity you're talking about there should feel included. And so if you tolerate jerks, if you tolerate cliquey behavior, if you tolerate anything that makes those people who are in the minority feel excluded, then you are part of the problem. And that's one of the things you need to fix. When you talk about meritocracy, you know what? The most toxic form of meritocracy is tolerating brilliant jerks. We've talked about it on this podcast before. Unfortunately, some of the smartest people are also assholes. You cannot tolerate that behavior. They're often, again, in my experience as well, they are often assholes towards women in particular. For whatever reason, that seems to be disproportionately where their jerkiness goes. And so if you do that, then that is part of the problem. Should every company have a 50-50 balance? No, that's silly. It's simply not possible, as you say, Chris. And even sometimes you have these very well-resourced companies like your Uber, like your Slack, Amir, like we are going to work really hard to recruit women into our workforce. Well, it's a zero-sum game because you're recruiting them from somewhere else, right? So global diversity within the ecosystem doesn't get helped by doing that. It's a sort of a local fix. One of the interesting things is often when you talk about diversity, one tends to rabbit hole towards gender diversity.
It's the easiest one to talk about, right?
Right, but there are many different types of diversity. Meritocracy is the right thing, but the question is, what does it mean to have a meritocracy? How do you judge that you are doing that? And I think what frustrates me about, again, both of the poles of this debate that tend to get the most airtime is they try to reduce something very complex to something very simple. This is hard. There is no easy fix. It's something we should struggle with and wrestle with all the time as leaders in the ecosystem and try to do the right thing within the constraints of what's possible.
The problem, of course, though, is it comes down to definitions of things, right? So as usual, I'm playing the devil's advocate here, and I want to be clear. I'm typically on the like, hey, we need systemic change and DEI is an important and serious issue. But just to continue to be the devil's advocate, when you talk about being a jerk or making it an inclusive and welcoming place, I think the meritocracy crowd that are railing against DEI as a concept are talking about the sensitivity that's creeping into cultures and workplaces. And I'll give you one very specific example that is not a gender-based one. My wife is Muslim. Most Middle Eastern people are Muslim. I happen to have a Christian family and an atheist. But there's an example I had recently where it was Ramadan and there were a couple of lunch gatherings and there was a Muslim woman in the office. It was a fairly common office. Everyone was in the same space. And someone expressed to me, man, it's Ramadan. I would be really pissed if I was her, if everybody was eating lunch in the kitchen like that. And I just thought to myself, like, this is an example of oversensitivity in the workplace, of DEI becoming overly extreme, where we're like, she's an adult, we're adults, we can manage our own biases, preferences, religions, cultures. This is not us being a jerk. This is not a diversity problem. This is people living together in the chaos of humanity. And so this line, this balancing act, this inclusion definition is just hard for people to find in real practical terms, but find the balance we must. There's a difference between somebody being aggressive, rude, not listening to the people in the room, and trying to account for every culture everywhere and making it work entirely about this.
I totally agree. Can I tell a funny story about this? When I joined Microsoft, they had an EMEA meeting, and I came from Tel Aviv, so it was a meeting of people from all of Middle East and Africa. All other Jews or Muslims, and they served pork.
If you exclude everyone equally, is that inclusion? Maybe it is.
Exactly. But just like a funny story that reminded me of that.
That's amazing.
Yeah. All right, guys, this is a really controversial topic. I'm sure there are a lot of opinions and heated debate we can have about it. We've shared our thoughts. Join us in the comments. Tell us what you think. We'll jump in there and join you for the discussion.
All right. So the next topic we wanted to talk about is Ilya Sutskever. I think I'm pronouncing his name right. The guy who was the chief scientist at OpenAI, who was part of the putsch against Sam Altman. He was out and he's got a new startup called SSI, which I believe stands for Safe Superintelligence. Part of the fallout at OpenAI was about AI safety. And so his new startup is really about trying to keep what he believes is the original vision of OpenAI, which is to achieve artificial superintelligence, but to do it in a way that is safe. So it's right in the name there, right? The quote here is, "We approach safety and capabilities in tandem as technical problems to be solved through revolutionary engineering and scientific breakthroughs. We plan to advance capabilities as fast as possible while safety always remains ahead." So in a way, this is not surprising at all. Another not very surprising thing about it is he raised an absolute metric fuck ton of money off no product at all because it's AI and he is one of the gods of the AI space despite the recent drama. So yeah, I mean, this is mostly an update. Be interested in your folks' takes on it.
I mean, he's not just the chief scientist or former chief scientist of OpenAI. He's the co-founder of OpenAI. He is seen as the brains behind its early innovation. I think he was the one that made the bet on transformers. He was the instigator, I think, of the coup against Sam Altman, and he's been awfully quiet since that coup, sort of buried down in the bowels of the company. And there's been this ongoing bubbling up of, are they really dealing with safety and alignment properly, or are they racing ahead for commercial interests? Yaniv, I think you stopped short of the most interesting and passive-aggressive part of the quote, which is, "Our singular focus means no distraction by management, overhead, or product cycles. And our business model means safety, security, and progress are all insulated from short-term commercial pressures."
What is their business model?
Well, by exclusion, what he's suggesting is that others, OpenAI, are subject to product cycles, management overhead, and short-term commercial pressures, right? That's by implication. He is very pointedly describing OpenAI as a clusterfuck of safety and alignment problems because of their commercial focus. This is the most pointed and public he has been about that. And I think it's worth really drawing that line. He's not just describing his company, he's describing it in contrast to OpenAI, and that's really important. What is his business model? What's his product? Who the hell knows? I don't know how you get all the money, get all the GPUs, get all of the people who are interested in the profit motive and still prioritize safety and alignment over everything else. I don't know how you do that without it becoming an academic research hub. I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm not even passing judgment on that. I'm just saying it's difficult to understand how you maintain that momentum absent the commercial focus. It just seems like a little bit of a difficult trick to pull off.
So first of all, I agree with Chris. The guy is super smart and might be successful by his own merit and could be. And the fact that he's like shitting on his previous employer or previous company is not new. It happens. People do that on the interweb. And a company without any corporate limitation or cycles or something like that is both potentially faster, but it's like a time machine. I've never seen company act like that. My main problem is that I don't think that safe AI will be built faster than the non-safe AI. So I think if you think about if I were to develop a car in the early days of cars, and I would say I need to develop the seatbelt and the sensors for collisions and all the things that we currently have in cars to make them safe, I would lose the race towards the first best car.
It's not an MVP car, right? You've got all of the safety features built in.
Exactly. I need a car that you put some liquid in and it drives, and no horses, please. That's the definition of a good car. I think AI is the same way. If we spend all our time thinking about safety mechanisms in AI, the team that didn't think about the safety mechanism will release the first actual GAI first. So I don't know how you do it in a way that you say, hey, all these meta features are important to us, but we'll be the first to market. I don't know how you do that.
Unless they're building the Jarvis for OpenAI's Ultron. Right.
Well,
they're building the counter AI, which will attack the evil AI.
That's a very interesting point. But like, yeah, look, I agree with you, Amir. Unless he has got some magical secret sauce, like that quote is obviously, you can say whatever you like in a press release, but his implication is that somehow he can combine safety and capability, what he's calling, the good stuff, into a single sort of model. So that if he can do it in a way that means that, he's got the best scientists and safety doesn't act as a brake, to your point, then maybe, but he has to win the competitive fight based purely or largely on capability. And, it's hard to see how he can do that. If he can, then cool. But yeah, it's interesting. Like, I definitely wouldn't be investing in this thing myself, but good luck to him. I mean, more competition is good. He's obviously a brilliant person and he's very principled. So yeah, maybe something good will come of this.
I think at the very least, what they're going to do is they're going to invent the harnesses, the methodologies, the techniques for applying safety mechanisms to other people's models, or how those other companies, as they're building the models, can kind of bake some of that in. So if they're planning to open source that research, that code, that technology, that will contribute perhaps to the super alignment and safety domain. But, we've talked on previous episodes at length about the question of, is making the AI safe enough to protect civilization from AI? Because it still will crater jobs, and it will still crater information warfare, and it'll still affect things, even if it's not creating biochemical weapons and taking over the world like Skynet. And so I think the idea of AI and safety together is a little bit of an oxymoron to a large degree, irrespective of how safe the particular technology is.
I'd still rather live in a disrupted world without Skynet than a disrupted world with Skynet. So I think it's I still think there's value here.
Yeah, you're right. I'd rather live in an economy that's disrupted rather than an economy that's been nuked by Skynet. I think that's a good point. Yeah.
Although with our current leaders, I'm not sure if AI is not the right way to manage us.
Well, I mean, at least there would be intelligence involved in the picture there, right?
Exactly.
Right. Every episode or so, Amir, you suggest the idea that you welcome our new authoritarian AI overlord.
I definitely would.
Look, man, this goes all the way back to Plato, right? The philosopher king, right? Maybe it just needs to be a robot. Do you think that safe superintelligence can ever beat OpenAI to the punch? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Companies like Atlassian, Quora, and 7,000 others use Vanta to build trust and prove security in real time. Automate compliance and start scaling your business today. Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast. I think it's actually quite a good segue to something that, Amir, you wanted to talk about, companies building the so-called picks and shovels, but is there that much gold being mined? So obviously SSI is another picks and shovels company. It's another big model. So
yeah.
What are your thoughts on this?
So I'm going to flash this meme on the screen. You can take a look. Basically, it's a tweet that shows a market full of shovel sellers, and somebody comes in and everybody's screaming like, "Are you a miner? Are you a miner?" And he says, "No, I'm here to sell shovels." The key here is that everybody's trying to build tools for developers that are building AI and agents. And I'm not seeing a reciprocal adoption by enterprises. Now, it could be that this is okay, and this is the time, and this is how things work. But what I'm seeing is a little bit of starvation. So a lot of frameworks, a lot of infrastructure for building AI agents and enterprise solutions. But I'm not seeing enough customers in enterprise saying, yes, this is what I need. I'm more seeing customers in enterprise saying, I don't know what I need and I don't know how to use AI. My manager told me to use AI, but I actually don't know what to do. So I'm hoping for the market to correct itself and for the pull from the market for enterprises to actually being able to use AI in a useful way. But that's not what I'm seeing right now in the market.
Of course, this whole metaphor, Amir, is about gold rushes, right? Like in a gold rush, you have the people selling the picks and shovels and the people digging the gold out of the ground. And it makes me wonder what would have happened in the old gold rush era if you had lots of venture capitalists just waiting there to fund the pick and shovel makers. Would you have ended up with the same situation, right? Because actually, the whole concept of picks and shovels comes from the fact that the people who really reliably got rich in a gold rush were the people selling the picks and shovels. So it seems like a smart business idea, but the reason that was the case is that most people in a gold rush were trying to get gold. And it's nearly like the picks and shovels metaphor or model has become overplayed. And if everyone's like, oh, I'm not going to mine for gold, that's too hard, it's too risky, it's too dangerous, I'm just going to quietly get rich selling picks and shovels. Well, if everyone does it, it doesn't work. A gold rush needs to be based on people digging gold out of the ground. And I think, again, most of these businesses are not good investments because most of them will fail. They're not getting enough traction. There aren't enough people using them. Question for me is this perhaps a necessary overinvestment that will actually fuel the gold rush ultimately? And, I think I mentioned this in a fairly recent episode. It's a sort of historical analog that I can't get out of my head, which is back in the dot-com boom. There was this huge boom in laying fiber optic cable. The companies like WorldCom just like getting huge amounts of funding, laying cable, saying, okay, the internet, the information superhighway is coming. Everyone's going to need bandwidth, and we're going to lay all this cable. And they spent tens, hundreds of billions of dollars, God knows how much, laying all this fiber optic cable that, guess what, no one needed yet, right? Because the internet boom was still more of a dream or like a vision of a future gold rush than the current gold rush. And so they all went bust. That was part of the tech wreck, massive overinvestment in infrastructure. And yet, the modern internet that took off in the 2000s and 2010s was only made possible because there was this huge amount of infrastructure assets that had basically already been, discharged through bankruptcy that everyone could take advantage of. So that infrastructure, terrible investment for the people who actually invested in it. If you take this macro view of, was it a good allocation of capital for the world? Hell yeah, right? So is that happening now? Like, is it necessary in order to enable normal people, normal companies to take advantage of AI, to have this huge flourishing of infrastructure investment that ultimately all that IP is probably most of it's going to end up in bankruptcy, but then it can rise from the ashes and then provide real value to the next wave and really drive that gold rush.
The typical cycle, right, of like birth, death, rebirth.
Is that a typical cycle?
It is the typical cycle, yeah, of people getting reborn from the ashes of the last generation or of the benefits and the success of the last generation. And it's also the typical hype cycle curve, right, where we go through that trough of despair. Everyone's like disillusioned. It didn't really materialize. And then it slowly but surely becomes real over years and years and years. The only difference here, I think, with AI is that it seems to be kind of happening faster than ever. I think, Yaniv, it was you that coined this idea of many, many episodes ago of like, this is a platform shift and revolution at TikTok speed, right? It's just going to happen faster than ever before. Amir, you talked about enterprises not adopting this thing and therefore the picks and shovels maybe laying fallow and sitting by the stream and not finding any gold, to keep the metaphor going. I think phase one is all about experiments. It's like people playing around, creating little experiments, seeing what this thing can do. Phase two is the major software companies adopting it into their core tools, right? Google and Microsoft and what have you. And then enterprise adopting it through those tools. Well, we already use Microsoft Teams, we already use Office, we already use Google. We get AI for free, more or less, right? Maybe for a few bucks a seat. Phase three, which is always the slowest phase, is going to be legacy enterprises around the rest of the world adopting it in their core business, writing custom AI or applying frontier models to their proprietary datasets and use cases. And that's always going to go slower than everybody else. The thing that, continues to strike me is that historically, Silicon Valley has taxed a lot of the economic value creation globally. And pick your number. 1 out of every $10, 3 out of every $10, 5 out of every $10, I don't know what. But someone out here once said to me, why are you trying to help these old media companies? My company at the time was trying to help old incumbents in the media world. He's like, our job at Silicon Valley is to disrupt the old players and to tax them for the benefit. And that's so true. Like a lot of economic value passes through Silicon Valley systems, and those systems tax the world. I think in the next cycle, the AI cycle, whatever you believe that number to be now, probably double it. So if it was $3 or $5, I think it's going to be $6 or $8 or $9 out of every 10 is going to run through Silicon Valley. Particularly if you think about intellectual labor as a service, right? Intelligence as a service. Well, hey, just use our fancy new, intelligence layer, replace half your workforce, or don't double your workforce, just outsource it to Silicon Valley. Whether it's now, 6 months from now, or 6 years from now, because these large enterprises are moving slowly, Silicon Valley is going to beat them to the punch and tax them for the privilege. The slower they go, the richer I think Silicon Valley gets. I'm not saying this is a good thing. I'm just saying it's a thing. That's what's happening, and that's a concern.
I tend to agree. But we need to see who makes money and who spends the money, because I think what you're saying is true. It will take time for enterprise to adopt this. But the question is, if you're a startup and you raised $40 million in your seed money in order to build something crazy useful, but the expectation is that you will meet that valuation in 3 years, you might starve because the enterprises will not be there to actually use your solution in a useful way. So I'm saying what the Silicon Valley is saying is adoption should happen in the next 3 years because we're investing all this money in making these solutions. So it's either going to be that the big companies will win again, which is my bet. So a lot of the big companies will buy the small companies and have enough timeline to meet the demand when it comes. Or we're going to see another chasm of delusion where the next wave of companies, the next wave of startups are going to reap the value that the current startups are doing.
But I think this happens the same way almost every time, which is, Taxi didn't adopt iPhone, Uber did. Hilton didn't adopt phones, Airbnb did. Blockbuster didn't adopt the new business model in streaming, Netflix did. And so there will be a whole bunch of disruption and collateral damage for, I think, B2C companies that are the next generation healthcare, insurance, finance, banking companies. This is what we talk about, what I talk about on this show incessantly, which is B2B is interesting, but B2B is in propping up incumbents. It's just helping companies do the legacy thing they do a little bit better. B2C is way more interesting to me. It is almost, in my mind, the thing you can classify as disruption. It is disrupting the legacy players. So those legacy enterprise companies that are refusing or unable or unwilling to act, and we have a whole episode about the innovator's dilemma just a few episodes back in our catalog, yet more of them will fall to the AI pure play native companies. More will fall this cycle than last cycle, and on and on and on.
But just to be clear, Chris, these B2C companies, they're the gold miners. The problem is, to Amir's point, is there aren't that many gold miners out there at the moment. Everyone is making tools for the disruptors to disrupt, and yet there are not enough disruptors disrupting. I think really the question here is this a bubble that will burst in the sense of you're going to have like an AI version of the tech wreck, you're going to have like huge numbers of these companies shutting down, you're going to have funds that specialize in AI going out of business? Again, out of the ashes, will that be reborn? Or is this something that we can proceed without there being that kind of massive crisis?
Yeah, I don't think we need to be sitting here in suspense. Yes, there will be a big explosion. Many of them will die, but many of them are also, they're not building tools for startups, they're building tools for enterprises. And that's my point, which is there's an overabundance of enterprise tooling. Really, the enterprises are probably too slow for this cycle, and some of these are going to die. And there's a lot of, Me Too's and also rans. And what I'm personally more curious and interested about is the native AI companies that will disrupt the status quo. And they're not necessarily going to be using the picks and shovels, or certainly not going to be using the enterprise grade picks and shovels. They're going to be using, the decomposable cloud services, the lightweight open source. They're going to compose stuff that's really bespoke and fit for purpose to build a next generation healthcare or insurance company, while Kaiser Permanente or whatever is like screwing around with bureaucracy. Now, to Amir's point, some or many of those will get acquired, keeping the incumbents incumbent, but they're not going to probably be driving the bulk of the innovation by adopting many of these enterprise tools.
I think time will tell, but I think what we'll see is a cycle of innovators. I hope it will match by a lot of demand. I actually think that the demand will come once a few good examples will happen. So a few innovators will actually show what good looks like. If you remember Angry Bird, if you remember Uber did that for mobile, showed people what good looks like. And then we will see a wide adoption of this, just like we did with the mobile revolution.
Join us in the comments and discuss this with us. How do you think the cycle will play out? Who do you think will be the winners and losers? And how should founders think about this to navigate to success? We'll join you there. The next topic we wanted to touch on very quickly was Apple's Vision Pro is apparently not succeeding. There's an article here on Gizmodo saying Apple is struggling to make us care about a weaker, cheaper Vision Pro. All reports suggest that the sales aren't fantastic, the demand and engagement isn't fantastic, and that they recently pulled the plug on Apple Vision Pro 2 in favor of a cheaper, probably Apple Vision, which is, the not Pro version. And, it's yet to be seen if anyone will even care about that. I thought this was interesting, guys, because it speaks to something we talk a lot about on the EDU episodes that Yaniv, you and I talk about endlessly on LinkedIn, which is that your first product is not going to succeed. Even if you're Apple, It takes putting something in the world and iterating in order for you to succeed. And this is true of the iPhone. It was not born fully formed. And it's true of the iPad as well. And it's, I think, going to be true of the Vision Pro. And I think it speaks to this idea that, as a founder, you can't just do MVP pivot. You need to do MVP grind, polish, and give your initial idea a chance to succeed. What do you guys think about the Vision Pro, about AR, VR, and where this might all be headed in the future and what it means for founders?
When you say like the numbers aren't fantastic, I'd say that probably what's happening here is they're more than not fantastic. They're really bad. And I think that what Apple's doing makes sense, right? That it was just too expensive, too heavy, too capable. And the next step being, like you said, an Apple Vision. Like the clue is in the name. Calling it Apple Vision Pro implies that there'll be an Apple Vision. The same way that you've got an iPad Pro and a regular iPad, and you've got a MacBook Pro and a regular MacBook, there was always going to be an Apple Vision. And it seems to me like they've deprioritized the Vision Pro in favor of the Vision. Why exactly? I don't know. I think the price was probably too much of a barrier. The weight was too much of a barrier. But I did have one other thought on this, Chris, which is we talked a couple of episodes ago about the Rabbit AI device and the Humane AI pin and how a lot of the problem with them, which were basically products that were massively panned, is that they took something that was really a developer preview or a hobbyist device and tried to sell it as a mainstream consumer device, and it simply was not ready. The Apple Vision Pro, I would say, was obviously way more polished than those things, but I think it was not ready in a different way. The price to value, the sort of comfort, the sort of general consumer readiness of it was simply not there. And so I think it was maybe a slight misstep by Apple to release this as a mainstream product rather than as some sort of developer preview, something or other like that, where I think the reception would have been quite different because it is a magical piece of tech. I've tried one. It is incredible, but it's not ready for that sort of consumer prime time. And if you'll recall Google's attempt in this space years ago, Google Glass, ultimately that was a dead end. It was not a successful product. But I'll say the one thing they did right is for years, they called it a developer preview so that at least the embarrassment, or you could say, the failure of Google Glass didn't bleed over into regular people spending thousands of dollars on these bits of tech that were not ready for regular consumer usage. And so I am still moderately bullish on the Apple Vision Pro sort of series. I don't think Apple will give up easily. I think the technology is amazing. I think once you get the exact UX right, once you get the size and weight and all of that right, it will be a killer device. But I think they got a bit ahead of their skis, and that's what we're seeing now.
I think ultimately people don't want to be in the office anymore, and they don't want to have a computer pancake to their face.
I think that's a way too broad statement.
I think there's a general trend amongst the, whatever you call them, Gen, whatever they're called now. They want to be at home. They want to be in, what do you say?
I just don't agree with that.
Why not?
Because I talk to Gen Z folks and they want to be in the office and they want to socialize, and the data supports that. So I just think that's not an accurate statement.
I mean, the sense that I get from a lot of people I'm seeing around the world is like they're enjoying their freedom. They're enjoying their ability to travel. They're enjoying their ability to be in Thailand or Dubai or wherever they are. And a lot of people moved out of Silicon Valley feeling like they could drop the mic and go somewhere else. And there are companies who are demanding, begging, insisting that their employees come back to the office, and they don't want to. They don't want to be in these enclosed spaces that are like dedicated to work. They want to be part of nature or their own personal space or freedom to work from a co-working space or a cafe. And I think shoving a computer to your face is even more oppressive and like cutting you off from nature and the world. And I think that's a counter trend to what people are trying to do. They're trying to integrate themselves into their space versus the other way around. And so I think VR is a difficult value prop. It's a difficult thing to sell people, especially for productivity versus gaming. I'm becoming more bullish on the idea that AR and smart glasses are the immediate term future for most people most of the time. And I think AI makes that even more true when you want to have a heads-up display or a heads-up camera to see the world and to load that into context. We talk a lot about how Apple doesn't want to be first, they want to be best. But in this case, I think Meta, having been in this for a long time, have had the opportunity to learn from the mistake of VR being their only bet and learn about the opportunity of smart glasses. And I think that they're a little ahead of the curve on the glasses side. And I think that's where there's a broader fit The image I just have in my head is just people connected to their environment in spaces that are more personal and more balanced. And hermetically sealed boxes in an office is not that. And having a computer smashed to your face is not that. Having delightful devices that you can they're light and they're easily throw in a backpack and keep going feels to me like where people want to go.
I could not possibly disagree more with your broad sweeping generalizations that are not tied to the reality of the data or the way people behave. Like you say, people want to be out in nature more, want to be connected to the environment. Everyone's fucking addicted to these things, right? Like there is no way it is true that people, as a broad movement, of course you can find these niche movements, Chris, but like as a broad movement, people are not moving post-technologically. Young people are actually really enjoying returning to the office, having human connection, actually. Where do AR glasses fit into all of this? And remember, Apple Vision Pro is AR, not VR, primarily. That is where all their innovation is. And I think exactly what it does is it actually does allow more connection, because instead of like everyone walking down the street hurting their C3, C4 vertebrae because they're staring down at their phones the whole time and like bumping into walls, they can have their heads up and they can have their virtual world and their real world actually combined. And so the issue with the Apple Vision Pro was simply the tech wasn't quite there yet, not that the form factor doesn't fit in with the vision that you were describing. And, you know, I think the idea of having a computer strapped to your face being oppressive, like if people were oppressed by their computers, then they wouldn't be staring at their phones the whole time. So I just disagree with that take.
Hang on, I didn't say people are throwing away their technology. I'm saying people are throwing away their work. Let's just look at these headlines, right? Meta mandates employees to return to the office, threatens termination for non-compliance. Amazon enforces strict RTO policies, urges employees to relocate to a hub office. Google intensifies RTO efforts, right? Salesforce requires employees to return to the office 3 days a week. I mean, this is a massive trend of people saying, fuck you to employers and screw this 9 to 5 commute to work nonsense. I want to live in an environment that is mine, that is personal, that is not oppressive, that is not LED lights and whatever. I think that is an obvious trend. I'm not saying that they're abandoning their devices.
You're projecting. I think the blind spot here is actually a generational one. People in their late 30s and 40s with young children, yeah, they want to stay at home. And they assume that people younger than them will also want to stay at home. That's not actually the case, right? And so I think it is much more complex than that. Different strokes for different folks. But to say there's a universal movement away from working in the office, I think actually, you know, that it's not playing out.
I think regardless of the fascinating debate whether people want to stay at home or go to the office, which we should have at a later stage, I want to talk about the technology itself. I think that virtual reality is an outcome that I don't want to see, other than playing games. I don't want us to be in an immersive world of just virtual reality, because I think then we will, like history shows, that we will adopt it and not like be in actual reality. And I hate seeing all these people with their phones attached to their faces all the time. And if they have something that they could attach more, they will attach more. So I don't want VR, or at least not in the way it's incarnated right now. AR is super interesting because I can see a lot of interesting use cases for AR, both in business and in gaming. And I really want that outcome. I want to be able to, even if I'm in nature, to Chris's point, and I see a new bird, I want information on that bird to surface above it so I know more about it. So I really want the use case of AR, but I think there's a lot of pain, both metaphorically and physically, in using those devices right now. That's the problem. The problem is that it's taking a lot of time, and it is possibly the computation, and there's some physical problems that we will not be able to solve in order to do that. I love the glasses, but I don't think you'll be able to augment on regular glasses that look like yours, Chris, all that information. But maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, I mean, the point I'm trying to make is that there's this interesting trend that I'm observing about people wanting more personal space and more balance in their lives. And I think that's a young trend and an old person's trend. And VR is counter that trend. I don't think it's lightweight enough. I think it's too immersive, too oppressive, and too all-encompassing. I think the answer is likely to going to be built from smart glasses up rather than VR down. Amir, you talked about, whether you'll be able to project anything on these glasses. I think if you were to say to somebody, I don't know, 20, 30, maybe 40 years ago, hey, you can have a supercomputer in your pocket. It'll basically be a thin piece of glass. They'll go, oh, you're crazy. Those transistors will never fit in there, right? I think the exponentials on top of exponentials will see us presenting some amount of data on the glass with some amount of reasonable form factor in a reasonable amount of time. But as I've observed in previous episodes, I think AI combined with a camera and combined with audio input output, I think obviates, minimizes the need to project things onto the glass. And I think generation after generation of smart glasses will be the trend, is my guess. That's my bet. That's my prediction. We'll see how it plays out.
You should be a VC.
Okay, folks, Chris and I had some spicy disagreements on this one, but what's your take? Do you think strapping a computer to your face is oppressive or the future? Let us know in the comments. So I think that the final topic we've got time to discuss, and Amir, I think this is something that you are very close to historically, is that the EU has indicated that it's going to file suit against Microsoft for abusing its monopoly. Stop me if you've heard the song before, right? For abusing its monopoly power in distribution of Microsoft Office to give Microsoft Teams an unfair advantage over Slack. And I think there was this graph that went viral about a year ago that sort of showed the growth curve of Slack, which was this sort of nice linear growth. And then this like Microsoft Teams came from nowhere and just like eclipsed Slack. And the truth is that, many more people now use Teams than use Slack, despite, I'd say, the fact that a large majority of people would say that Teams is an inferior product. So what do you say, Amir? Does the EU have a point?
I think it does. Microsoft, for years, have been using something called enterprise agreements to force customers to use and get more of their products. I think that that's something, and I've heard that when I was at Slack, I heard that from customers, from big customers saying, hey, I'm getting such a big discount. I'm basically not paying for Teams at all. Because of the bundle, we're getting a lot of the value. We're getting SQL license, MS SQL license for free because we're using Teams. And I tend to agree with you that Teams sucks in a professional assessment of the product. I think it's an inferior product. I think the way they do the Zoom-like or like the video conference is very bad. And most of the people that use it say that they use it because they're forced to use it, or at least the people that I've talked to. And I think the EU is doing the right thing. They're saying, hey, like bundling like this when you have such a stronghold on the market you should get a slap on the wrist for that. Will Microsoft build eventually a superior product? It could be. They have a lot of products that are amazingly good. I think Excel is one of the best products I've ever used. So it could be that they grow and build a great product at the end. But right now, since the inception of Teams, they've been using their enterprise agreement and enterprise relationship to drive a product adoption that is not based on its merits.
So breaking news, distribution beats almost everything else, and products grow to meet the needs of their users. Shocking. I'm really very frustrated by antitrust laws. Unless you're out there breaking people's knees or creating some kind of weird sales contract that says you're not allowed to use someone else's company or tool, or you're making it impossible to link to Zoom or to Slack, I think this is a little bit over the top. It's called Microsoft Office. It's software for the office. Historically, it has meant PowerPoint and spreadsheets and documents, and now it means team collaboration and SharePoint as well. Is it bad to bundle those capabilities into Office? I don't think so. And I think it's within their rights to do that. I don't know the story intimately. Did they do some like truly anti-competitive behavior where they're somehow blocking making Slack work as part of their environment? That would be a different story, but...
So can I show you how it's done? Let's do a game, okay? You'll be an IT manager responsible for procurement, and you're using Slack, or like you want to use Slack, and I'll be the salesperson from Microsoft, okay? So we want you to adopt Team, not just like buy the license, but to actually adopt Team.
Okay. Well, we're using Slack right now. We like it. It's pretty cool. Amir did some really cool work on the developer platform, so we want to keep using Slack.
So you can use Slack, but then you will have to pay $10 million more on your enterprise agreements. If you actually want the discount on the enterprise agreement, you'll need to implement Team, because I'm measured on adoption. And if you want the discount on your enterprise agreement, we need to shake each other's hand, okay? So yeah, uninstall Slack. I'll give you all the information that will make the fear, uncertainty, and doubt work and make you look good. Make them all install Team. You scratch my back, I'll give you the $10 million discount on the enterprise agreement. Does that look fair to you?
Well, again, as I'm saying, is if they're using their distribution advantage and they're using their scope of their product is growing naturally, organically, that is not a problem to me. if they're in there saying, hey, scratch my back and scratch yours, and if you actually use Teams, I will reduce your bill by $10 million, like that's crossing that line that I was describing, which is moving from a distribution advantage to really like kind of blackmail and inducement, right? And so, yes, that's not okay. If that's the behavior the EU is railing against, then that's fair, legitimate, and concerning. That's not what I'm seeing in the news. When I see these headlines and they go, well, you bundled Teams for free or nearly free as part of your suite, I'm like, yeah, every SaaS company in the world is adding features to the pricing tier that you're already subscribed to. That's par for the course. And the only difference is in scale versus in substance, right? And so I don't think that's fair. If you have a pricing discussion that says, if you adopt Teams and you scratch my back, I'll give you 10 million bucks. I mean, like, that's a different conversation.
That's actually how it works. So the way it works is that you buy Teams and then they apply a discount on the entire SKU. So it could be that you actually adopt something and get a much, much better deal on your enterprise agreement. So
Yeah.
I think that's the EU point. The EU point is not you're giving it for free because, for example, WhatsApp gave text for free for everyone. That's not a monopoly move. The monopoly move is saying, hey, we will force you to do something that is not competitive. And I think that's the main problem that I'm seeing.
I mean, I'll admit I've not read the actual charge, but the quote from Margaret Vestager, who's the competition person in the EU, is, we're concerned that Microsoft may be giving its own communication product Teams an undue advantage over competitors by tying it to its popular productivity suites for business. So that sounds more like what Chris is talking about. Like, I think,
yeah, that's true.
If they've caught Microsoft out basically bribing companies to abandon Slack, then I think that's different from bundling.
So if they own the distribution and there's a link to an email saying start a conference, and that link could only be Teams, that's another way of forcing the customer to actually make a call, right? Because, for example, in Google Calendar, you have the ability to add a Meet, but you can also integrate into Zoom. So my question to you both is like, if the UI is forcing the customer to use Teams, is that cool or not?
Well, I mean, forcing is an interesting question, but I think integrating is something else, right? And like, I look at this from the point of view of the customers. Integrated bundles are fantastic because everything works together. You only have one account manager, one person to deal with. It's integrated. It is a much nicer experience. And so if you're an established business and you're trying to grow the utility of your product, then yeah, you're going to do this. And is it anti-competitive? You know, it's funny. One of the sponsors of this show is Rippling, which is a startup that I love because their contrarian view is, we're going to build this bundle from the beginning. So you can't accuse us of being anti-competitive because we're building everything from the beginning, which is obviously expensive. But, you know, the reason we were keen to have them on as a sponsor is like, this makes a lot of sense. I've felt the pain of a lack of integration between all these tools. I want one vendor to give me all the stuff. I want it to all work together. I want one account manager. I want one invoice. That is great for me. By the way, rippling.com/TSP for your first 3 months free. But seriously, like, this is like a secular trend, right? This is something that customers want. So Microsoft is giving the customers something that they want. And yes, it forces competitors out. Again, like nearly going back to our DEI conversation, I don't think there's like a simple one side or the other. There's a nuance and a trade-off here. But I'm like, yeah, having a bunch of like 8 out of 10 products that all work really well together, to me is a better experience than a bunch of 10 out of 10 products that are sitting in silos.
I agree, but I think people should have a choice to choose between those two.
I agree with that too.
Yeah, I just really struggle with calling out a company for doing something that everybody else is doing or would do in their position. It just seems so hypocritical. And it seems also like, in Australia, there's this term tall poppy syndrome, where, you want to cut down the tall poppies because they're standing out. If I was the product manager at a suite of products called Office, and I was building a document product and a slideshow product and a spreadsheet product, and I noticed that people seem to really like to chat about these documents, I would bloody well build a chat product, and I would bloody well link to it from all the other products. That's not anti-competitive, that's product management. And should I, must I allow you to switch that link to a competitor's product? As far as I'm concerned, like, fuck off. That's my product. I'm going to link to whatever I want to link to, right? Microsoft has been the first best platform company in the history of the world. They've created so much economic value with Microsoft Windows to allow you to set your default browser, to let you rip out pieces, to let you rip parts out and replace parts. And they've sort of set the expectation that their ecosystem is configurable and hot swappable and replaceable. But that shouldn't be regulated. That should be a choice they make to make their product better, worse, more user-friendly, or more user-hostile. And people should vote with their wallet. And as far as I'm concerned, if you're an enterprise that chooses Microsoft Enterprise Software, you suck. Go use Google software, it's better. But you can't be upset for Microsofting and for PMs PMing and for success of an ecosystem. I just think that's really silly, and I just think it's over-regulation. If I was Slack, I'd be pissed off. I'd be really upset. But I'd have to understand, like, that's capitalism, unless, and of course, they're, doing all this crazy underhanded discounting and stuff.
So I also used to work at Microsoft. I worked at Microsoft even twice. That's the company that I worked for the most times. And I think Microsoft showed the world what good looks like in terms of like interoperability. They were across all the machines. You were able to plug and play and configure every nook and cranny. And I think here, if it's true, they did the wrong thing. And I think the regulator...
Yeah, but they got raked over the coals for it, Amir, right? Microsoft was the most open platform while Steve Jobs and Apple were trying to lock everything down. And they still got pulled into antitrust and still got screwed around. And if you believe Bill Gates, were forced to miss the mobile and internet revolutions. I just think Microsoft was the big bad evil for a long time, and in many ways rightly so, but in also many ways, like, they set a bar for themselves that everybody then goes, well, hang on, why don't you be even more open? It's like, how much more open do you want us to be?
My closing remarks here are, I think that openness is much, much better than not openness. And I think if companies don't do it right, I don't care if it's the regulator or the wallet. I actually prefer the wallet because I don't want a lot of regulation. But I think openness is much, much more preferred for the customer to be regulated. So in a Tesla, you can't have Apple CarPlay and you can't have Android Play. And I think that sucks. Is it the regulator to solve this, or is this the wallet to solve this? I don't really care. I just want it to be open and integrated.
I don't like that either, which is why I don't buy a Tesla. I'm going to buy a Porsche, right? I mean, a Taycan if I want an electric car. So like, I'm just going to choose who I go to, who I work with. My background is open standards, open protocols, open APIs. I'm all about the open ecosystem because I believe that's better for the user. I believe that's better for my company. I believe that's better for my platform. But it's none of the regulator's job to tell me I have to do that. That feels like not open. That feels like actually that is a closed government system mandating open private enterprise. And that feels like, get the hell out of here. That's such hypocritical nonsense.
Yeah, I tend to agree that the government should keep to governing other things.
All right, guys, those are our thoughts. I think depends on where you land on capitalism and competition. What do you think? Join us in the comments. Do you think the EU is being heavy-handed and is really just punishing Microsoft for doing what companies do? Or do you think that Microsoft is the big evil corporation that's taking food out of startup founders' mouths? Let us know what you think down in the comments.
I think that's the pod. So, Amir, if folks want to find you online, where's the best place to go looking?
So, Blue Sky, LinkedIn, and I'm Amir Shevat on all these networks.
And Chris?
Yeah, I'm on all the social networks at Chris Saad. Follow along on LinkedIn. I'd love to see you there. Also at chrissaad.com and chrissaad.com/newsletter.
And find me primarily on LinkedIn. I'm happy to get connections from TSP listeners. Just let me know that that's where you come from and how much you love the show. Flattery will get you everywhere. So yeah, looking forward to seeing you on LinkedIn. All right, thanks guys. That was fun. Have a great week.
All right, see you later, guys.
Bye-bye.
Today's episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. To sell to the enterprise, proving security is essential. Vanta allows you to breeze your way through to SOC 2, ISO 27001, or Essential 8 compliance and unlock major growth for your company. Go to vanta.com/TSP today. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to claim your $1,000 off.